Greetings, everyone. Welcome back to our module on prehistoric Japan. In our last video, we completed our overview and a little bit of exploration of the Jomon period in Japan, which is a period from roughly 10,000 BC to 3000 BC. Now we are going to turn to the Yayoi people and look at what happens when a different group of people coming from outside of the archipelago come into Japan from the south through Kyushu, that island that the southernmost island of the four major islands in Japan, and bring with them aesthetics that we can trace, at least in part, to Korea and to traditions of pottery in Korea and to China, and see how these kind of merge with and in some ways overwhelm the traditions of the vital, lively Jomon aesthetic that we spent time looking at. So without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so let me play my slide, start the slideshow here. All right, so in our last video, we looked at the Jomon aesthetic, which could not be better captured in terms of pottery than in this middle Jomon flame cord-marked work, where the lively, vital cord structure of the corded elements of pottery, both as a means of construction and a means of decoration, have come vividly and playfully and vitally to life, as though these forms are living in many ways. There isn't a sense that it isn't stopped moving since it was created more than 5,000 years ago. So the Jomon period is a period that lasts quite a long time in the Japanese archipelago throughout all four of the major islands. And these figurative works, the dogu clay figurines we looked at in the previous module, go back and review them if you're unable to state why we call and what are some of the formal elements that help us recognize these as Jomon. I ended the lecture just simply pointing out that the Jomon pottery and figures, as well as signs of other culture, can be found throughout the four islands, the major islands of Japan. We're now turning to Yayoi culture, or Yayoi culture, 300 BC to 300 AD or 300 BCE. I use the dating system interchangeably. The Jomon culture here, we can see, I have kind of put it to the north part of Japan with two of its distinct characteristic objects. And to the left here, Yayoi culture, which is below Korea. So we're looking here at what is today North and South Korea, mainland China, and up north, the Khabarovsk regions of Russia. And I think even without me speaking, you can see a very dramatic difference aesthetically with the kind of pottery that the Yayoi culture bring into the Japanese islands, the Japanese culture. The Yayoi people are those from which today's Japanese trace the origins of their civilization. It's named after a street in Tokyo where the first site was discovered, and it's rapidly superseded Jomon culture, spreading throughout Kyushu and along the Seto Inland Sea. So the Yayoi culture moved relatively quickly to become the dominant culture in the archipelago, with the exception of a fairly significant mountainous wall region here that seems to have stopped them for some time, although they ultimately spread up farther north as well. It is not certain whether the Yayoi culture was the product of a substantial immigration from Korea and northern China or the result of a rapid internal evolution. But there were a number of new techniques that appear at this time. So let's go through them. First of all, we have rice cultivation that is brought into the Yayoi culture into the Japan. Rice culture is a very important agricultural technique for an agrarian society. It's specifically wet rice cultivation, and it is brought into Japan via the south, perhaps from Korea, most likely, which was learned it from the more southern portions of China. Rice cultivation brought with it greater village organization and a technology superior to that utilized earlier by the Jamon people. During the early part of the Yayoi period, bronze working reached Japan from China by way of the Korean Peninsula. This might look familiar to you. And I just want to clarify why there's a beautiful, elegant, and vessel that I have not yet discussed sitting in the middle of the Sea of Japan. That is a Yayoi cultural vessel, very simple, reduced forms, and it is simply present there to remind you of this tradition of pottery that we'll be turning to shortly. But first, after the cultivation of wet rice cultivation, we have the introduction of bronze, understanding of how to cast in bronze, metallurgy. When we say metallurgy, that means working with metal. And it's coming from China. And this might remind you of the bronze bells that you looked at in our module on the Bronze Age in China in the Shang and Zhou dynasties. And that's no accident. This is certainly a source of the origins of these bells, no doubt, may be traced into that culture and time period. During the early part of let me just quickly, before I say further, excuse me, the final technology brought into Yayoi, the Yayoi brought into the Japanese islands here is weaving, the knowledge of weaving. So we have metalwork, weaving, and a new technology of cultivating wet rice cultivation, staples for developing a more complex, stable society. And when society grows more complex and more stable, it develops a greater need of systemization, laws, regularity. And in some ways, we can see perhaps this expressed visually in the works of art. That's only speculative, but there is a significant aesthetic change, and it may be also simply a matter of transmission of an aesthetic coming with the Yayoi people, particularly out of Korea. But scholars have stated that what we see in Yayoi pottery, for example, here, just briefly, this is a very different kind of pottery with a much greater sense of order, regularity, symmetry, and in some ways, one might argue, discipline and control compared to, another good comparison here. On the right is pottery by Yayoi people, and on the left by the jamon. I'll talk more about this in a minute and some of the techniques used to create it. But just quickly, a comparison, we see a very vital and exuberant, free, playful form versus what feels like a much more controlled form. And that control, some scholars have linked to a more complex ordered society. Maybe so. It could also, it certainly is an aesthetic of simplicity, the absolute minimum of form that we come to find in Japanese aesthetics to this day, that moves through the centuries, this wonderful, reduced in the sense of details, subtle and simple and nuanced kind of forms that can only hint sometimes and never fully express necessarily a full-blown design, but hint at it. This interest in this simple, the raw. It is and I'm not expressing it very well, but it is a Japanese aesthetic. It's quite different than what we see here. And this design has been linked more to the aesthetic, perhaps of a Siberian kind of methods, or the nature of the culture itself, which was less stable. It certainly wasn't nomadic, but it wasn't as ordered and it wasn't as complex as the Yayoi. And for that reason, some scholars speculate that the aesthetic reflects this. Be that as it may, for us, we see two very different pots here, and we're going to walk through why we call the one on the right Yayoi, and in the one on the left, of course, we've already talked about in our previous module as a jamon aesthetic. So quickly, bronze, pottery, wet rice cultivation, and weaving. So then we find ourselves in a village. This is a reconstruction of a middle Yayoi village at the Yoshinagari site in Saga Prefecture in Kyushu. That's the very south. Remember the small southern of the four islands. And this is a reconstruction based on archaeological evidence of a more complex society that is more stable, more settled, and it's developing needs to hold grain, liquid, cook food, heat food, transform food from raw to cooked. For example, rice is not really very edible once it's dried. When it's simply soaked, it needs to be cooked on a fire. So these pots are sites of containing a substance, preserving it, or transforming it through fire and heat in the act of cooking. And I've already spoken a little bit about the aesthetic of how what we see here is, incised lines and very, very regular. A little bit of hints, though, of the corded patterning of the jamon still. This is certainly, this pot is a wonderful kind of answer to anyone who might suggest that the Yayoi simply wiped out or pushed away the jamon. We see definitely influence here of that pressing as an aesthetic. But that pressed cord is now controlled in a master pattern of a kind of zigzag. So it's been contained, literally contained in these hard lines. Similarly contained here. And then these are some kind of decorative medallion forms. And along the top, again, a kind of regular pattern as well. Similar points may be made about this work. The elegant form of this jar, built with clay coils, then smoothed to an even base. One of the techniques that the Yayoi did is they would make a very thin dilution of clay. I don't know if, imagine clay is you're working with it, it's very pliable, it's not so wet that it's sloppy like mud, but you can turn that very clay into a mud-like sloppy consistency that's very wet, and then you can smooth that over a partially dried pot such as this and create a really nice smoothed out surface. And that is exactly what the Yayoi did. They were very interested in this quite smooth surface aesthetic. This was probably used for grains or liquids. And its size is enhanced here. Its fullest point and its pinched point at the top with bands of clay now that have been kind of flattened, maybe with a flat knife instead of rounded. The small tapered bottom indicates that this jar was supported either with a separate base or by inserting it into a depression in the ground. So, this, you can imagine how this would hold up very well if it was placed in sand, about one fifth of the way down into, say, some sand. It would hold up very well. One source of influence of this aesthetic, this very smoothed out, simple, rarefied, and adorned surface, definitely recalls the contemporaneous works from the Korean peninsula, indicating the strong ties between the Japanese communities and the Korean kingdoms at the time. So here's a jar with horn-shaped handles from the Silla dynasty in Korea. So you can see how similarly smoothed out the surface is, and the emphasis on an adorned aesthetic. And with the emphasis on the smooth, you have an emphasis on the full surface of the jar and its finish. And the imagining touching it is very different than the Jamon works, which have a very different tactile effect on us as beholders. An important innovation that Yayoi pottery brought from Korea is this controlling of the clay using a spinning flat wheel. So a wheel that is laying flat on the ground that is spun like a clock or a cake plate. It's spinning flat. And this spinning motion, which can be activated with a treadle or a crank, allows for a centrifugal force to begin to shape the clay just by movement and motion, the actual movement. And that centrifugal force creates very, very circular, even lips of the clay pot. And if anyone has watched a potter work with one of these wheels, it's almost like magic. You see how this clay just seems to lift from the potter's fingers and rise up with a will of its own. And that's that centrifugal force moving and shaping the clay with the guiding hands of the potter. And as you can see here, you can take a string and you can kind of cut in and pinch a waist as you're working with these vessels and this centrifugal force. Here you can see how that has happened. It's a very even surface here. And there are many other wheel thrown pots that we find in the Yayoi period. I haven't brought them in. I might put some in our module so you can look at a few more. They can become exquisitely delicate and with long stems and delicate lips. And I think it's important perhaps that you see a few more. So I think I will add those to our page, our module page. You can look at them. Now, we're moving now from pottery to metallurgy. Metallurgy, that is working with metal, mixing metal, making an alloy, which is what bronze is, and heating metal to shape it, which can be done with iron as well. It was introduced from the Asian mainland during the Yayoi period. And here I've just brought in a photograph of a container of molten bronze that has been sitting in a heated oven. And this is molten metal being poured into a mold below. And once it cools, will take the shape of the mold and then can be finished as a bronze object. So we have very distinct objects. We have weapons. Here is a kind of antenna-shaped, handled Yayoi sword. We're going to focus on bells and not the swords here. Bells are very rich and distinct. The bells are known as dotaku. This is a bronze bell. And there are several kinds of aesthetics that we find with these bells. Here is our bell that we're looking at, and it matches, this is from these are 4 kinds of bells that we find during the Yayoi period. I don't expect you to know these, but we can see here that this is a square blocked pattern. And it's been extraordinarily finely finished. Remember, this is metal that's been finished with a very textured pattern. Each side had 6 panels and linked to this 12 months of the year. Within each panel, we have what appears to be some kind of agrarian work being done at the bottom. Here we have a figure appears to be perhaps shooting an arrow at a deer. So these are various scenes. It's hard to know what if they're symbolically relating to the seasons or some other narrative or representational system is appearing in these smoother, clearly defined windows that are have a much smoother background so as to allow for these relief, these very, very low relief images to kind of shine through, and to be very clear that to clarify that the windows from their frames, we have a remarkably regular hatched pattern. Again, remember, this is all done in metal, so it's a masterful work in bronze. These bronze bells, the smaller bells may have been used for sound and music early on, but they grow so large that it becomes quite clear that for the Yayoi, they weren't really for music, they're for some kind of ritual purpose. We have another style here. This is known as the Ryusui, or the flowing water design. And we find that here, Ryusui is a flowing water design here, or Ryusui mon here. And what is so wonderful about studying these really ancient objects is we can find that in the visual vocabulary, and the kind of, in a sense, the aesthetic consciousness of the future artists that come many, many centuries later, there is a way in which these aesthetics kind of echo through, rather like the Tao Tie echoes through Chinese bronzeware. Begins in those jades that we looked at and moves into the bronzes, and then we see the form reappear. It's similar, these kind of flowing water designs, sometimes also associated with a maze. These become very present in painting and printmaking that we'll look at next week, much, much later. So what we're looking at here is an aesthetic, a vocabulary, a voice, a sensibility that is characterizing much later Japanese art that we first find bedecking these bells. It should be noted also that, and there's an extensive page in your module that introduces you to what's called Shinto, which is a belief system, a spiritual system that it's believed came to take shape during the Yayoi period. And I'm not going to talk about it at any great length now, but it is one where the world is animated by spirits and energy. One is kami, and the kami is it has a kind of intelligence, and one prays and worships it, but doesn't fully define it. And so when we look at some of these objects, especially after you've read about Shinto in the module page, you might decide you kind of feel and see something perhaps resonating in these works, because this indeed is the time when we understand Shinto and the Shinto shrines to take shape. And Shinto, rather like Taoism, precedes Buddhism, and yet when Buddhism comes to Japan, in just the way that Taoism in China is able to absorb and shape and transform the Indian manifestation of Buddhism in deeply Chinese terms, so too with Shinto, as we will see. So just kind of keep that bracketed in your mind as we're moving forward. So that's the closing of our discussion of the Yayoi people. Very important prehistoric culture that that the Japanese today trace their cultural origins to. So we have one final video in the series on Japanese prehistory, and that is the Kofun period from 300 to 710 CE, and that's our next video. So I'll see you back here soon.